So, we're going to be examining Reconstruction era Southern society. The reason we're doing this now is because we are stepping into the South and the Deep South through Huck and Jim's sort of misadventure of traveling down the Mississippi River. Remember, Huck and Jim's intention was to reach Cairo as it's spelled, but they pronounce it Cairo, and to travel up the Ohio River towards the Free States. So we could assume their plan was to reach the state of Ohio or even further, maybe up into Pennsylvania, towards Pittsburgh, which was free country, and from there they could travel pretty much anywhere, and Jim would be free. Remember, this story is set in the pre-Civil War time, which can be a little confusing because we're actually studying the post-Civil War time. But Mark Twain, what he's doing here, in a manner, is he's commenting on his present day, the 1880s, and what had just happened in the country in the 1870s, Reconstruction, by setting it in an earlier time. Right? It kind of gives him this freedom to say and do things in his book that he might have not said and done otherwise. So Huck and Jim we are going to be exploring the South and seeing what the South was like through the eyes of Huckleberry Finn and through his adventures with Jim. So let's look at some of the big changes that were going on in Southern society and some of the things that were going on for the people, the regular folks, in the South in the post-Civil War years. The first thing we're going to examine is sharecropping. Sharecropping is an economic system. It's a system of essentially tenant farming. We're going to look at what that is. So, sharecropping, two main elements to it. We have an economic element and a social element. So the economic element was this. Essentially, post-Civil War, we have no more slavery, right? Slavery's been outlawed. Slavery's been abolished by the 13th Amendment. And these freed slaves, these freedmen, these new black citizens are pretty much homeless at this point. Their whole way of life was around the plantation. Now, they had desired freedom forever, but remember, many of them have now been in slavery for generations, some for several hundred years. They have no other life other than being slaves and just trying to survive this really brutal, awful existence on the plantations. So they finally get their wish, which is to have freedom. But with that freedom is going to come huge challenges because there's nowhere for them to go. There's no jobs for them. And so this creates a problem. Now, for the wealthy landowners, the slave-owning classes that have just lost all their slaves, they also have a problem. Now, they have their problems are a little different in that they have nice houses, they generally have educations and training, and they can do many things with their lives, unlike the freed slaves who have very limited options. So what is going to happen is sort of an arrangement of convenience in that both sides sort of needed each other in different ways. So here's what I mean by that. The wealthy landowners, the former plantation owners, well, they still own plantations, but they no longer own slaves, have a valuable product. They have cotton or tobacco, but generally cotton. That cotton needs to be farmed. It needs to be harvested. It needs to be picked. And cotton farming and picking cotton is a very labor-intensive job. You need lots of people to do it, and it takes a great deal of work. Therefore, you had all the slaves. These slaves need a place to live, they need a roof, they need food, and they need to work to get all that. Another complicating factor that I don't have here on the notes, and just like all the notes I'm going to give you this year, I'm going to give you some writing, I'm going to give you some speaking, and your notes should be a combination of the two. But the other complicating factor that I don't have written down here is that this is now a cashless society in many ways. And here's what I mean by that. The Southern economy was wiped out by the Civil War. The Southerners had switched over their money from American money, Union money, to Confederate money, Southern money. But that Southern government no longer exists. All that money they had is now in worthless paper that no one will take and no one will exchange because nobody wants it. It's from a dead government. So they lost all of their cash. So they don't have anything to pay anybody with. But they have all these crops to grow. They have this fertile land, this beautiful farmland, and they have no one to work it. The freed slaves are desperate for work and for money and shelter and food that comes from that work. So they work out a sort of marriage of convenience in that a new system emerges, and we call that system sharecropping. And what that is the landowners say, okay, you can have these 50 acres. I will rent them to you, to this former slave family. In exchange, now you don't have any money to pay me in rent, and I don't have any money to pay you in wages. So here's what we're going to work out. You harvest the crops, you work the land, you harvest the crops, you give me X amount of cotton, how many tons of cotton, or however they measure cotton, bales of cotton, whatever. You pay me in cotton. Whatever's left over from that year's harvest, whatever you don't owe to me, is yours to sell, and then you can make a little money. I'll give you the tools you need, I'll give you the land, I'll even help you build a little house you could live in, and then off you go. These are your 50 acres. At the end of the year, though, you got to pay me my rent. Did this for lots of slave families. They have all these tenant farmers. Essentially, they're renting the land to farm it and do all the work for you. In exchange, you get a big chunk of the cotton that you can then sell on the market and make cash. So the Southern landowners found a way to get cash flow back in their pockets. The freed slaves now have a new way to work and make a living, although, as we'll find out, it's going to be only a slight improvement from slavery. And here's what that means. Sharecropping was set up to be exploitative, to kind of take advantage of these freed slaves. Remember, many of these freed slaves, almost all of them, were illiterate. They had never been given the opportunity to go to school. They might have been smart and sort of common sense, savvy, sort of like Jim is in our book, right? But they were not educated, and they didn't understand things like contracts all that well. And they definitely didn't know how to read the fine print in a contract, which said like, hey, if you don't pay me this amount of cotton at the end of the year, well, then you're going to be in debt for the next year. It's going to carry over, and you're just going to have to keep working for me until you get out of this, except I've set up a system to where you can never really get ahead. You're always going to end up owing me at the end of the year because they have all these little tricks in there. Someday, many of you in this class will rent an apartment or a house. And maybe you'll have a great landlord, and maybe things will work out just fine, and it'll be a good arrangement. But I can tell you from my experience, and others might as well, that a lot of landlords are not really in it for the humanitarian sort of implications, right? They are in it to make a profit. and they will look for everything to keep your security deposit, which gets really sort of contentious if you ever rent. And what that is you pay the landlord a bunch of money up front, like 2 months rent sometimes, to say, here's this money just in case I can't pay a month, or something gets broken in the house, it's my fault and you got to fix it. Here's the money up front. And at the end, when I move out at the end of the lease or whatever, any money left over, you can pay back to me. Well, in my experience, generally, you don't get a lot of that money back. A lot of landlords find ways to make sure that they keep your deposit and you'll never see that money. But, maybe your experience will be different. I don't know. My point in telling you that story is that that's exactly the situation that many of these sharecroppers found themselves in. They would work really hard, they would do the best they could, but at the end of the year, they'd be like, well, your harvest didn't come in that great because the weather wasn't that great this year, and you're like 50 bales short. Well, that's a lot of money, so we're just going to put that on your bill for next year. Oh, and you had to get some new tools because the tools you were borrowing from me all broke. Well, we're going to have to charge you on that and your account for that too. And that your old mule that was, you're using to work the farm, the mule died, so we had to get you a new mule. Well, that's got to go in your account too. So it looks like you're really in the hole. So, just keep working hard. Maybe next year you'll be out of debt and you'll make some money and get out of this cycle, but not likely, right? So that was a huge economic change, but one that didn't necessarily move the freed slaves, these new black citizens, into economic opportunity. So also some major social changes, right? You have all these freed slaves, these new black citizens. Well, for them, it was sort of a mixed blessing, right? So that's a kind of a quote from some black historians and scholars in that that, as I've just described, their situation changed, but it didn't necessarily improve in a lot of ways. So they had some freedom. They were not slaves or owned or could be bought and sold. That's good. But the trade-off is that because they weren't property of a wealthy slave owner anymore, and if you damage somebody's property, you can get thrown in jail or get sued, right? And you don't want any of that, so you wouldn't hurt or kill somebody's slave. Maybe you could hurt or kill your own slave, but even that would be silly because you could sell them and make money from them, right? So as that they were now free people, but that they didn't really have rights, they now faced a new thing, which is a lot of racial violence and a lot of murder, as we've talked about earlier this year, many in the form of lynching. So what this new system of sharecropping and this new sort of social arrangement that comes out is different than the old pre-war system, but not necessarily better. And it had a lot of problems, as we've outlined. And you could say, like, well, why didn't these freed slaves, why didn't they just move away? Why didn't they go anywhere? But you have to remember, in post-Civil War South especially, there weren't any ways out, right? Where are you going to go? Like, you're going to walk? Where are you going to walk to? You have no money. You have no food. Like, if you're a pioneer going out west, that would cost the equivalent of like $20,000 in today's money to get a wagon and oxen and all the supplies you needed. And even then, it wasn't a sure thing. The other part of this, too, is you have to remember that the slaves were completely uneducated and unaware of what even was out in the world. They had been so cut off from the world, so deprived of information and knowledge about the greater world that they wouldn't necessarily know where to go. Like, they might know that you could be free in the North. They might have heard stories about that. They might have been told by someone like a Harriet Tubman type that journeyed from the North and South and helped slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. but even then, it was like a fantasy almost, right? That there was anything other than this. Not only that, but many of them had family now in the South that they were finally being reunited with, and weren't going to be in a hurry to leave that, right? To be like Jim, right, separated from his wife and children. Think about the inhumanity of that that's being described in Huckleberry Finn. But he's all he wants to do is reunite with his wife and children. So if that meant journey staying in the South, he would do that. And many slaves found themselves, freed slaves, I should say, found themselves in that position. So moving on from this. All right. The next concept we're going to look at has to do with Reconstruction. And these are a little, sort of abstract, these terms here, but the first one is a group of people known as carpetbaggers, right? And this has a very negative connotation. You can kind of pick that up by this image being depicted here. Is that these were people who journey, as if you can read the sort of sideways writing in this old political cartoon. These are people who journeyed from the north to the south during the Civil War, to sort of take advantage of the South being in disarray, sort of broken. We'll see why and how that took place. So this is part of another subheading here that we'll call political changes. So, of course, the Southern governments were all destroyed and needed to be rebuilt after the Civil War. The Confederate national government was gone. The state governments all had to be broken down and sort of rebuilt in a new way. However, some of the laws that the radical Republican Congress had passed stipulated that the leaders of the Confederacy and the Confederate governments could not hold office, and they could not even vote. That will go on for varying lengths of time depending on your situation, but essentially they're going to have to re-earn their citizenship by proving their loyalty and taking a loyalty oath to the United States, which is something controversial that we'll get into when we talk about President Andrew Johnson and his Reconstruction plan. But essentially what you need to know from this is that the South was in disarray, had no political leadership, and there were people who journeyed from the North to the South to sort of take advantage of this situation. Now, some of these Northerners were more well-intentioned, and they weren't all terrible people, but a lot of them weren't great. And they went down there with only thinking of themselves. They weren't trying to help the South for sure. They were trying to help themselves become political leaders or get government appointments of different kinds and to work their way up the ladder. Many of them even bought up these abandoned plantations, or these plantations that were in completely disarray, some of them which had great, great farm soil, which then they could turn around and resell for a higher profit. So this name, carpetbagger, is a really negative connotation. It's used today in politics about people who will like move to a state, live there for 6 months or a year, whatever the minimum requirement is to get residency in that state, and then immediately run for political office in that state. And a lot of times they might have money or resources or connections, and so that helps them to work towards being elected. But a lot of the locals really end up resenting them, especially in places where people had deep roots. They don't like outsiders coming in and taking over and telling them how things are going to be. Another quick note about this, where's this word come from? This weird word, carpetbagger. Well, these guys would literally take all their possessions and put them in the middle of their room, and they didn't want to spend money or buy luggage, so they would throw all their possessions into the room and then take the carpets and sort of wrap their stuff up in the carpets and sew them together and then throw the carpets on their train that they were taking. And so they'd literally show up with these bags, these luggage bags made out of carpet. So it was a literal term for somebody getting off a train with bags made of carpet, um, hence carpetbaggers. Another related term to this is scalawag. Scalawags were similar to carpetbaggers in that they were sort of opportunists or people sort of taking advantage, at least in some people's view, of the South and its vulnerable position. The big difference, is that scalawags are Southerners. So these were people who many times joined the Republican Party. At this time, remember, the Republican Party is the party of the North. It was the anti-slavery party, the party of Abraham Lincoln. And these guys would join the Republican Party and in that way get some benefits because now they're sort of like sucking up to the winners of the war. They might get jobs in government, or they might get some business connections that help them out. In many ways, they were even more hated than the carpetbaggers because these people were seen as traitors to their own kind. An important note that I put there, though, is that some of the so-called scalawags were people, like I described in the sort of episode on the Colfax massacre, right, where you had like the Calhoun family, a guy who genuinely was uncomfortable with slavery, who freed his own slaves, and then after the war was really working towards racial equality and trying to make things better. He was somebody who would have definitely been called a scalawag and somebody who would have been hated by his neighbors, which he was. But some scalawags were generally or genuinely bad people who were just taking advantage of their neighbors' bad luck and really had no greater political aims and no real sympathy for the freed slaves or anything like that. They were just looking to have personal gain, whether that's financial or political. Okay, the last point we're going to touch on here is not so much a term, but it was a government program. And this is in a time where the federal government, the national government, didn't really do things like this. The federal government didn't really step into the lives of individual citizens all that often. But post-Civil War, we start to see more of this, and as the country changes and the federal government, the power of the federal government gets more and more important in that we need, as we progress as a society, that you start to see more of this. But anyhow, this is one of the first of those programs, and this is a program called the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was, as I say here, the title "Good Idea, Poor Execution." I've used this before when talking about Reconstruction. But this was another one of these good ideas with poor execution. So the good idea here, as passed by that radical Republican Congress in the early years of Reconstruction, was a government program to help these freed slaves, these new black citizens, and the idea was to address the problems that they had. These Republican Congresspeople at the time were very aware of the problems, what they were. Many of them had gone and visited or spoken to people who had visited the South and said, what needs to be done now? Like, what next? We've accomplished this big goal. We've abolished slavery. We've passed other amendments to achieve racial equality and citizenship for these black Americans. What now? Well, they need jobs. They need to be educated in some basic rudimentary way, like basic reading and writing. They need to be taught how to register to vote, who the candidates are, how our political system really works. They don't know any of this stuff, so they need some education. A lot of times they're going to be really in desperate situation. They're going to need food and shelter, real basics of survival. Um, and so that's what they're going to do. They're going to build schools. They're going to help register voters. They're going to help these people find work. And sometimes that work was sharecropping. And in certain situations, they're going to provide food and shelter for people. And so it was basically like an emergency relief program for this huge emergency we find ourselves in, which is that we have 4+ million freed slaves that are now in need of help. So, some of the positives, thousands of people were educated by the schools built by the Freedmen's Bureau, and they're going to help out in all the ways that they do, finding them jobs, food, shelter, things like that. Tens of thousands more are going to be helped by this program. The basic problem where we get into poor execution is that it was so poorly run. A good idea, but when it came to execution, it's going to fall under the leadership of President Andrew Johnson. As we've talked about a little bit, and we'll talk about some more, he's in the running for the worst president of all time. And the reasons were multiple, but essentially, he was not good at the job. The job takes a certain set of skills, which he completely lacked. Remember, he was a racist. He was a white supremacist. He was not for racial equality and thought slavery was actually a good thing. So, not the right guy for the job. And then, because he's going to be in charge of this program, he's going to cut it at every chance he gets. He can't completely get rid of it because Congress passes it with an override veto or a veto-proof override vote. But he's going to make sure he just cuts its legs out from under it in any way that he can. By firing people who are good at their jobs and hiring people who are bad at them, and intentionally, and then making sure he cuts all the money out of all the different programs that they're trying to offer till it's basically useless. The only thing that kind of saved it from just being a complete debacle was that there were many really dedicated abolitionist people in the North who were just passionately anti-slavery and passionately for racial equality, and they volunteered themselves. They went down there, they worked in the schools, they helped people for with their own time, or they donated large sums of money to the Freedmen's Bureau directly to these volunteers to allow them to do their work. So they kind of sponsored them to go down there and do it, if that makes sense. So that's the sort of situation that was going on in the South. You have a new system arising in which African Americans are going to be free in some ways, but in many other ways, their lives are not that much different than being under slavery in this sharecropper system. You have intense, violent political rivalries, as described between the carpetbaggers, scalawags, and the former Confederates. You have some good intentioned programs to help these new black citizens, but it's going to fall really short of really being effective because it's going to be so poorly run. And so I'll finish with this political cartoon here. This is by one of the most important political cartoonists in American history. His name is Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T. And Thomas Nast drew some of the most significant political art of this time period. And this image here is something you'll see in lots of textbooks and things like that, because it sums up so vividly what exactly was going on and what the plight of these freed slaves is going to be. And you can see here, I mean, the statements are pretty clear on how he feels about it, and you can see who's to blame, right? Remember, we're talking about these institutions being kept in place, the institution of slavery, the institution of white supremacy, through this terrorist violence by groups like the KKK. There was another group like it called the White League, which you see portrayed here. We don't really get into as much, but they were essentially like a community organizing. They weren't as outwardly violent as the KKK, but they definitely supported the work of the KKK, if that makes sense. And you see depicted here lynching. You see the schoolhouse burned down. That was like one of those Freedmen's Bureau schoolhouses that will be a target of the Klan because they are very threatened by this idea of an educated, participating black citizenry who is going to be able to, challenge this system that they're trying to put in place. And you can see there the phrase at the top: "The Union as it was. This is a white man's government." So reinforcing this reality that was very painful and hard to see, but that there are so many people who didn't really want racial equality. In fact, wanted racial hierarchy. They were not happy that slavery was gone, but if they couldn't have slavery, they were going to definitely have white supremacy. So that was the situation that they're going to find themselves in, and that is the time period in which Twain is writing. So remember, when we're reading Huck Finn, we're got to see the world through his lens, right? He is examining this world in which he is living with this very critical lens, with this very sharp eye, and he sees all these problems, and he's going to talk about them through Huck Finn, our narrator, our main character, our protagonist. And he's going to be able to show us these problems in a way that if he just talked about it in his current day in the 1880s, that it would have been people could turn their nose up at it and say, oh, well, he's just, one of those people. He's not really, he's just making this stuff up, or he's exaggerating, right? But because he's going to kind of put it in the pre-Civil War time, it's going to give him a little bit more freedom to be even more critical than he might have been able to do otherwise, if that makes sense. It's kind of like when you can set a show today to an older time period, or set a movie in an older time period, it just feels like it's a little bit more separate from our world, but it's still kind of about our world. So I don't know if you guys watch shows like Mad Men and things like that, where it's set in the 60s, but a lot of the storylines are really kind of about current issues, and there's still so many parallels to current issues. It's that same sort of concept. All right, so that is an overview of that Reconstruction era Southern society, what was going on in the Southern society, and all the major changes that were taking place.